If you're not super familiar with the kind of cars in this series, or even the kind of cars which Bugatti has produced in the past, you're probably wondering why this car is in Unsung Heroes, because surely the Bugatti Chiron is not an unsung hero. It's a well-known car, and it's going to replace, and is replacing, the Veyron. How can that possibly be a forgotten or understated car? Well, that's because this Chiron is not that Chiron. In fact, this Chiron, ironically, predates the Veyron itself, because this car was produced in 1999, at around the same time as vehicles like the Bentley Grenadier and the Volkswagen W12 Synchro, which would later become the W12 Nardo. A pretty awesome time as far as supercar concepts went in the late 90s and early 2000s, and this is yet another example of that. Now, as far as its design, this car was, in an even more direct way than the Veyron, designed to be a direct replacement to another model. But whereas the new Chiron is designed to replace the Veyron, this Chiron was intended to replace the EB110. And of course, the EB110, although similar in some ways to the Veyron, all-wheel drive, luxurious, quad-turbo, in essence, it's not the same kind of car, because the Veyron is an all-out machine in every possible sense, really, apart from being a pure track car, whereas the EB110 was always more of a kind of long-distance supercar. It had more attention to luxury, comfort, long-distance driving than some of its more hardcore rivals. And that was one of the greatest things about the EB110, because it harkened back to the early days of Bugatti as a brand. Because Bugatti always did go racing, but at the same time they were very opulent, elegant cars. So the EB110 was perfectly suited to that. And the EB110, for me personally, is still my favourite Bugatti supercar ever. It's not my favourite car that they've ever made, that would have to be the Royale, but the EB110, as far as supercars go, is definitely my favourite that they've ever built. This car, though, was very interesting in terms of the differences that it had to the EB110, the new Chiron, and even the Veyron itself, because in some ways it did lead into the Veyron, but in other ways it was very, very different. And in some ways this car is actually quite remarkable and unique within the market, or at least it would have been were it produced. Now, of course, those supercars that I mentioned earlier, all in their own kind of way, led up to the Veyron. The Veyron was kind of like the Avengers Infinity War of cars. All of these other Marvel films giving these nuggets leading up to Thanos arriving. Getting a bit nerdy there, but you know what I mean. Likewise, Volkswagen, Bentley, Bugatti themselves, all building these disparate supercars which would end up each giving a piece of themselves to what would ultimately become the Veyron. And in this case, the Chiron had something very interesting which kind of outclasses even the Veyron itself. Because with the Grenadier or the W12 Nardo, the engines were fairly similar. I mean, in the case of the Bentley, it basically is the engine that the Veyron would end up having, but in a lower state of tune and a little bit less refined. With this car, it's beyond the Veyron, because this is also a W engine, but it has even more cylinders than a Veyron. This is not a 16-cylinder supercar. This is one of the only 18-cylinder cars ever built. Only one of these was produced as a concept, as I said, in '99, and it has a smaller capacity, but as I mentioned, more cylinders. It's a 6.3 litre, and it is a W engine, a W18, which in its own right is an awesome concept. Now, the engine is nowhere near as powerful as a Veyron. It's got around 550 horsepower, about 480 pound-feet of torque, and interestingly, underneath the very, I would say, classy looking and certainly unique, kind of oddball style which Bugatti is known for, the EB110 again is a great example of that, there was actually underneath relatively modest underpinnings, if you consider a Lamborghini to be modest, because the chassis and even the all-wheel drive system of the Chiron were from a Diablo, in particular the Diablo VT, which is one of the superior models of the range. Now, that engine is slightly different to the Veyron as well, not just in terms of its size and its cylinders, but also in the actual layout. The type of W engine is different, because with the Veyron, you've got 4-cylinder banks with 4 cylinders in each bank, making up that W16. With this car, you do not have 4 banks, but instead 3, with 6 on each. So a very interesting layout and a very, very different one to the Bugatti. Now the performance is of course nowhere near the same level. It's slower than the Bentley as well, slower than the Volkswagen. Top speed is quoted anywhere between the 180 region to over 200 miles per hour, some say 205-ish. I would probably tend more towards the higher of those two, given the fact that it is essentially the next thing on from the EB110, and is also based in part on a Diablo. So I would expect 200 miles per hour is fairly believable, if not even more. The quoted 0 to 60 isn't as impressive, anywhere between 4 and 5 seconds, but again, this is more of a luxury supercar in a similar way to the EB110. Now ultimately it didn't reach production, and the car which in a funny kind of way actually did succeed the EB110 was one of my personal favourite cars, the B Engineering Adonis, which after the EB110 failed, some Bugatti engineers, hence B Engineering, used what was left of the EB110 production and turned it into a brand new car. And that is the gorgeous, I think, Adonis. Totally different car, but actually did reach production with about 21 cars built, which is of course more of a production scale than the Chiron ever had in this form at least. And this one actually debuted in concept form, of course, at around a similar kind of time as 2 other Bugattis, a coupe and a sedan, which both also used that 18-cylinder engine. So it would have been pretty interesting if all 3 of those cars had been produced, and we'd have these crazy 18-cylinder Bugattis. Not particularly pretty cars in the case of the coupe and the sedan. Personally, I think this is a great looking machine, and in a weird kind of way, the front end really reminds me of a Cadillac Cian concept. The back end looks like nothing else on the road, maybe a hint of Maybach in there, perhaps, like the Accelero, but even then, not really. So ultimately, although this car didn't reach fruition, again, like the Honorier and the Nardo, it led into what would become the Veyron in kind of a vague sense, but more so in its overall theme, that top-tier, super luxurious, attention to detail kind of supercar that the Veyron would of course ultimately become. So it's a car which not many people talk about. Quite a few people have seen this car, but don't necessarily know much about it. So I think it certainly deserves a place here, if not for that crazy engine alone. So, if you are new to this series, of course you can check out plenty of other crazy cars by clicking through to the playlist of all of these episodes at the end. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.